All right. Good afternoon, Dad.
Good morning.
Today, today is Friday, August 8th, and today's the big day, right? This is the 10-day deadline that Trump set.
Right.
Now he's supposed to make some big announcement. What's going on now? Is there going to be an
It's real.
announcement?
It's really hard to say, because this whole thing, the threatened secondary sanctions, it's gone through, you know, s- we've seen several permutations of it, right? And this is the most recent. The most recent deadline is today, as you say. Earlier was September 2nd, and then that was the 50-day deadline, and then there was 10 or 20 days, and then 10 or 12 days, and then he just set it as October, not October, but rather August 8th today. And then it's unclear what connection it has to anything that's going on. I mean, just recently he imposed sanctions on India, and he said, one of the stated reasons for the sanctions, especially the second penalty, first it was 25%, and then an additional 25%. So India's at 50%. And the reason for that additional 25% was the fact that they're selling Russian oil, or not selling rather, but buying Russian oil. Um, but that happened before the August 8th deadline. And now, of course, the big customer, is China. China buys more Russian oil than any other country, even more than India, as far as I believe. Yet we're not hearing anything about China. He's been asked about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, yeah," but I think it's clear that he's been told by many people, that you just can't do it. Look, they've got too much leverage. They can hurt us a lot more than we can hurt them. But so why did he ever set this deadline in the first place? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, if anything's going to happen today. Already something's happened to India, and that was linked to the deadline, but that happened ahead of schedule. There are other countries. Turkey has apparently purchased a lot of Russian oil, but nobody's mentioning Turkey. Turkey, of course, is a NATO member. The Europeans buy a lot of Russian oil, but they buy it through India. So it's okay for them to buy it, but then India has to be sanctioned. And then the odd thing is there have been some exemptions carved out for India. And one of those exemptions is actually um, oil, oil which they actually sell to Europe, oil products, refined oil, diesel, that kind of thing. And a lot of that's Russian oil. Uh, who knows what's going on?
So why is he singling out India? Is it because he knows he can't attack China? China's too big, so he's like, okay, I'll go after India, claim a huge win, and we'll maybe just kind of don't mention China, and everybody will forget
Yeah,
about it.
nobody will notice.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that's basically it. It's just that there's some hope that India's soft. I guess in previous, during, the days following Liberation Day, India actually appeared to be more accommodating. Unlike China, China was very firm from the start. We're not going along with this at all. We're not playing this game. You're going to do this to us. We're going to retaliate. But the Indians were much more flexible. And maybe there was a hope that they would be flexible again. And then it just in general, okay, they are the number two purchaser of Russian oil. And but China, we really can't go after them, so we'll just go after India's the soft or the weak link. Maybe that's the hope, but it doesn't seem to be working. India is saying, we're a sovereign country, we're not going to do this. We're going to buy oil from whomever we please, and they have continued to buy Russian oil.
And when we say that there are now 50% sanctions now levied on India, my understanding is that that doesn't really paint the whole picture. Like you said, there are a lot of carve outs. From my understanding, is they're mainly targeting the diamond industry. It seems like that it's actually a small percentage of India's exports that are actually being directly targeted. Is that right?
Yeah,
The
I wouldn't say
sanctions.
it's a small percentage. We're still talking about billions, even tens of billions of dollars. I mean, it is going to affect the Indians. Leather, diamonds, you mentioned, that's one of the big ones. But there are a lot of products that are going to be affected. The ones that are exempt are pharmaceuticals. That's a big one. Yeah, the oil products. And then, yeah, there are a couple other categories, which are significant. I think actually electronic devices too. That was true, by the way, for the Chinese, maybe to a lesser degree. But remember, they made exceptions for consumer electronics, laptops, that some very significant product categories. And I understand it's also true for Brazil. Brazil's also been, slapped with 50% tariffs. So there are exemptions, but still, I mean, um, these are going to significantly affect trade between the U.S. and these countries.
Right. What I think Trump's trying to do is he's trying to pinpoint products that maybe won't have much of an effect on inflation, because this is my worry, is that he goes out and says, look, we levied 50% tariffs on countries like India or whatever, and your price of your Walmart goods aren't going up. It's like, yeah, because he isn't targeting the energy sector. He isn't targeting more elastic goods. It seems like he might be making carve outs for items that he knows won't hit the average everyday consumer in the pocket so much. So as he's able to say, like, look, these tariffs, I'm raking in all this money, and the everyday American citizen might be thinking, well, okay, maybe it isn't affecting inflation. Do you think that's the strategy?
I don't know, because the thing is, there are so many countries that have been sanctioned. To be very, more properly so, they've been subjected to tariffs, and some, not as high as in the case of India and Brazil, but quite high. Switzerland, for example, 39%. And, all kinds of Southeast Asian countries are around 30%. And then the, the Europeans are looking at 15%. When you add it up, worldwide, there is going to be an impact. It is going to have an inflationary effect. India by itself it's not going to make that much of a difference. It won't. India just doesn't sell all that much to the U.S. market. It'll matter, like if you're within certain industries, or if you look for certain consumer items, you'll notice the difference, but the average consumer wouldn't notice the tariffs that have been imposed on India. China's a different story. We would notice pretty quickly, and we were beginning to notice when the Trump administration climbed down from the previous 145% tariffs on China. So this is all kind of silly again. It's just like, that's the main customer, and you're just we're not talking about them. Maybe he'll come through and slap the 100% tariffs or 50% tariffs or something on China today. I don't know, but he's just not talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I shouldn't try to reason what Trump is thinking. It's, try to apply some logic to it. Like, maybe this is his plan. It's like, maybe just assume that it's just pure chaos. But the tactic that Trump seems to be adopting is always to bully and to threaten, and it just isn't working anymore. But we see him constantly only using that method. It's just like, you better do this or else. I'm giving you a deadline. Like he said, like he's the school teacher and these are errant school children, or all these other countries, these great powers. Why doesn't he try to adopt a more friendly approach?
Yeah, that's just not Trump. It isn't. He doesn't seem to understand how diplomacy works. This is not diplomacy; it's bullying, and you can see it actually does work, at least in the short term, with small, weak countries. Small countries and very dependent countries like the Europeans. It did work in the case of the EU. It did work in the case of the UK. These are big countries, but they're just so utterly dependent. They've made this conscious choice to depend on the US rather than taking advantage of, the opportunities afforded by the emerging multipolar order. And so they've been put in a position of extreme weakness relative to the US since they just caved in. And then small countries like Panama, and other smaller Latin American countries find that they just don't have a choice, but at least in the short run, they cave in, and he gets what they want from them. At least some of what he wants. It's unclear about some of his claims, but the tariffs are indeed imposed. But in the case of these larger countries, Brazil, India, China. These are great powers or near great powers, and they have a sense of pride and they have options. And clearly, this is actually having a negative effect on our relations with these countries. We've had historically good relations with India. India has always pursued a policy of neutrality, going back decades and decades and decades. They were really the leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War years. Um, and so they've always made a point of maintaining good relations with the U.S. while also working to maintain good relations with Russia and to a lesser extent with China. But now they've had friction with China, but that friction seems to be subsiding now. And most likely, with these kind of this very hostile approach taken to India, it's going to drive them closer to China. So we see, for example, as a consequence of these tariffs, the Chinese just announced that they're canceling purchase of American military equipment that they were planning to purchase. I believe it was some U.S. fighter jets, and
The
they
F-35.
canceled the order. They have no. I don't think it was the F-35.
No.
Yeah. But anyway, it doesn't really matter exactly what it was. It was just a major order of weaponry from the U.S. and they've canceled it. And I think it's just a sign that look, if you're going to be unfriendly, we're not going to make an effort to be in your good graces because it doesn't serve any purpose. It seems. You won't respect our neutral status, and this is something that's very important to us. This is, and we're just not going to be pushed around. We're a country of 1.4 billion people.
Right, it's very understandable. Right, it's completely understandable. It's hard to understand what he's thinking, because even when he does secure a deal with like the European Union, the UK, or Japan, he just gloats. He makes it feel like, the other guy's side got screwed, that it was somehow a zero-sum game, and he just says, haha, like those guys, those suckers, I took them for a ride, basically. That's how he acts. It's like my like Henrik, my son, he's like, whenever we play a game, he's like, haha, I win. It's like, well, but he's three.
Right.
And Trump isn't.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. No, I think it's very short-sighted. I mean, he can make short-term gains, and you could argue that he has succeeded in these dealings with, let's say, Europe and the EU and the UK, for example, and these smaller Latin American countries. You could say that, he's made gains. But each of these countries, they grin and bear it, but they're angry. They are, and there's a lot of anger within Europe. There's, unfortunately, there are a lot of willing vassals that just seem to say, yes, Massa, this is what you ordered, we will do it. But if you want to maybe end this vassal mentality on the part of the Europeans, this is probably the best way to go about it. It's just really, rub it in like he's doing. And so you have people like, it was the Prime Minister of France, who was really furious about it, and I'm sure others are too. And it's just like, I think by doing this, these people are so used to, most of the people in charge are so used to just following the U.S. lead, that it's really hard for them to change their mentality. And that's what you see. But there's got to be other people waiting in the wings who are truly angry about this and are looking at options and saying, maybe before they were willing to go along, this is an arrangement we've had for decades, it's worked. They say, it's really not working now. We got to look at other arrangements. And the more it doesn't benefit him any to gloat. And it has the effect, right, again, of unnecessarily angering these people that he is, who are on the other side of these deals. And it's certainly going to goad them to look for alternatives. I think there's no question about it.
Right. Do you think this move has pushed India then fully out of America's orbit? Is that what it's done?
Well, I think it's probably too early to say that, but you could say that they're taking a step in that direction. Um, um, you know, they have made further moves. You don't know if this was going to happen anyway, but they certainly have taken further steps to ameliorate their relationship with China. They were taking a step in that direction, but this is obviously a further incentive. And then there was the cancellation of that order. I mean, that's a sure sign. And I don't think they're going to, the Indians are going to continue to have a policy, that puts neutrality first. But I, but it, but they're going to make adjustments to the course, and that to this policy, and I think we can see them already. That the U.S. is going to have its role, its importance in this balancing of relationships is going to be reduced, and they're going to try to improve relationships with China, and maybe further solidify the relationship with Russia, which is already very strong. But here it makes a lot of sense to make it stronger. They've said Russia, over the years, including during the Cold War years, has always been a reliable partner. Never tried to twist their arm. Never did any of these kind of things. They've always kept their side of the deals, and at the same time they haven't interfered in their relationships with other countries, unlike the U.S. I think even during the Cold War years, sometimes the U.S. would try to pressure India, to reduce its relationship with the Soviet Union back then. But the Soviet Union, from what I understand, never did, and Russia hasn't. So it's something that say, well, this is the kind of partner that we want to have. And I think we just want to actually strengthen our partnership, expand it.
If the U.S. if all of it does is it just twist arms, or it secures these deals and gloats about it, then you think that all of these people that live in these countries, they'll begin to just resent the United States and no longer want to buy American goods anymore. I think this would have to have an impact. I mean, think about if you're in the UK or you're in Japan and you just secured some car deal, and then Trump was just like, look at these Japanese suckers, took them for a ride. If I was a Japanese guy, I'd be like, I don't want to buy an American car. Maybe I'll start buying goods otherwise.
Right.
I think this has got to damage just the American brand globally, right? Are we seeing any impact on that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's probably too early to say, but I think again in the long run, even in the medium term, that's inevitable. Again, like soft power was was very important in maintaining U.S.-led global hegemony over the decades, and it was very powerful. It was something that. Yeah, you can even see the after effects of it here in Russia, where I am right now. But because of U.S. actions, that has been greatly diminished. Yeah, I mean, I think in the past people wanted to associate themselves with the U.S. It was certainly true here in Russia during the 90s and the 2000s. But now, no, not so much. There's a residual. Maybe respect or for American brands, but it's been greatly reduced. There isn't that love of America, which used to really exist, in Russia and still exists in some countries. But yeah, because of recent American actions, it's drying up, and that. Again, you can lose the soft power and still through military might and economic might, you can maintain a certain amount of control, but the control becomes much more difficult. It's much better if you have actually kind of willing partners, people who want to be with you, want to work with you. You have governments that understand their people actually are pro-American. There's very strong pro-American sentiment, and they work with it. If that starts to dry up, then the whole that process of control, or that becomes much more difficult to carry out and governments again begin to look for options. And the thing is, there are a lot of options these days. There was a time, like we pointed out, where again, like if Trump was president 25 years ago, he could do these things, and a lot of these countries would just have to bow down and accept it. But he can't, now it's just not so easy. It's easier for India to say no. and in China, very definite no. There was a time when they probably couldn't. They would have been very greatly angered, but they would just have to, they would have to concede. They would have to accept a lot of the tariffs or whatever that were imposed on them. Those days are gone. So, yeah, you're angering these people and these governments, and these governments now have options.
There's always quite a significant time lag between policy and then when we see the actual effects on the street. Do you have an idea
Yeah.
when you think we might be able to see the impact of everything that we're doing? Because right now it has to be damaging, as we're just talking about just the reputation of the U.S. brand globally. Demand is going to go down. It's already affecting directly with the military industrial complex. You just mentioned that we didn't make that. India just canceled its big military order. I think people are going to want to buy less U.S. goods because they just don't want to support the United States because of its behavior. Just this uncertainty with all the tariffs has to be putting a dampener on investment within the United States, because who wants to invest if the rules are changing every other day? So
Right.
are we able to, but we don't see the damage yet, right? We are seeing some worrying numbers with jobs and,
Hmm.
the inflation seems to be kind of just so right now. We don't really know, but I have a feeling that all this chaos that he's been doing the first year, we'll begin to see the effects in the second or third year. And do you have any idea of how bad you think that
Yeah.
could be?
Well, yeah. Again, there is quite a time lag when you're talking about investment. And inflation too. It's just like for example, in the case of these tariffs, when the tariffs were first threatened, what I understand is a lot of these companies, importers, for example, imported more than was necessary to get it, to get the goods into the country before the tariffs were imposed. So there were large stockpiles, and then they were able to, sell off those stockpiles, and that way they were able to avoid it. And I think maybe some of those stockpiles still remain. So you don't see the effect immediately, and then, price. A company is often doesn't make these price decisions immediately. They wait, they see, they kind of maybe test the waters in the market, maybe raise the prices a little bit, see what the response is. But over time, inevitably, the prices will change. And I think they'll change, we'll see the effects. I'm sure there's some effect already, and there will be just more effect as we come to the end of the year and into next year. Now, investment, the impact of investment is slower. That's sometimes like when you're talking about building a factory or whatever, this is a multi-year kind of project. But you're right, the chaos in our economic policy, it almost seems like it's really not right to call it a policy, but it's just this constant flurry of executive orders, tariffs that are slapped on this country and that, willy-nilly, for whatever reason, and then explained in all caps and in 10 exclamation points. This has been going on for a while, and sometimes they're reversed, but then they're reimposed, and yeah, that has a very obvious dampening effect on investment. You just imagine. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that. But if you're going to, if you're looking at investing like hundreds of millions of dollars and sometimes even billions of dollars, to build up manufacturing plants in the U.S., you're considering that option. And maybe, because of tariffs, you have to have some sense of, certainty that, okay, because this may take 3 or 4 years to do it. And again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. But then what happens if, well, next year he changes his mind and actually reduces the tariffs, or then the next administration comes in, because this is just sort of, he didn't, this was just Donald Trump. It's not it wasn't something that was passed by the Congress, debated, and then there was just a general consensus within the political class. This is what we need to do. If you do it that way, it may take a lot more time to get it done, but once it's done, it's much more solid. And then investors looking at that say, okay, that's the way it's going to be in the U.S. for the foreseeable future. That's just the new reality. So let's adjust. make our long-term plans. But now you can't make long-term plans. You just don't know what's going to happen during this administration or the next administration. So what you do, well, you just withhold investment. You just say, I'm not going to risk my, these hundreds of millions of dollars on this. And maybe you start looking at other parts of the world that are more stable.
Right. It's crazy to say that, to look at other places that are more stable, because that's what the U.S. was. It was
Right.
supposed to be stability. It was a place where you could
Right.
park your money and know that it would be safe. But that's not the case anymore. And that's got to have a huge effect. And, there's rumors of a recession on the horizon. And we always, this happens. It's just part of the normal business cycle. But I'm getting the feeling that this next recession could break the United States. It's like every recession we have is a heart attack, and then we use our resuscitation machine, which might be quantitative easing. But you use it too much, and you're not
Right.
changing your lifestyle habits. This time we go into cardiac arrest, and we try quantitative easing, it would just go into flatline. Or we, instead of flatline, we hyperinflate. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but you understand, right? That's what I'm worried. Do you think that's a real risk, that this next recession could be the last
Yeah.
recession for the U.S.?
Yeah.
It would break it?
Well, I'm not going to make that prediction, but there are worrying signs that we've never seen before. There is definitely a move away from the dollar and into gold, and that's something that we've never seen. Again, the U.S. money has been cheap. Borrowing it was basically you could borrow it for free. Essentially, the interest rates were so low for such a long time. But and inflation was so low for such a long time. You just can't do that now. I mean, things are changing. It's just because, well, again, I guess I probably didn't explain that very well, but just because of the uncertainty, that was the big draw for the U.S. dollar and for U.S. bonds. You say that, okay, well, maybe I'm not getting the best return on my money, but I can park it there for 5 years, 10 years, whatever. I buy a 5-year bond or a 10-year bond, and I just know that it'll be good at the end of that time. There won't be hyperinflation. There won't be, the U.S. government will still be standing. And these other places, I just don't know. I think that certainty is gone. And so the U.S. dollar doesn't have the same draw. And therefore, we see that the interest rates are rising. And that puts, well, that means that money is no longer free, really, for the U.S. government for a long, long time, because of the reserve status of the U.S. dollar, and again this general reputation for safety. The rest of the world was kind of financing our debt, and we could just spend freely and not worry about the consequences. Now we have this huge debt, and the rest of the world is starting to lose interest, or rather, is looking elsewhere now, and is moving out of the bond market in the U.S. It has become a rout, and maybe it could turn around again, but there's reasons to be concerned. Without that financing by the rest of the world, we're in real trouble. So when, like you say, if there is a recession, we go into a serious recession, we've always depended on, in recent, decades, on just the printing press. And that's, quantitative easing. And again, we could get away with it because the money was free. The money's no longer free. And it's going to be, we're going to find ourselves in a very, very difficult position.
Okay. You're
Yeah.
lagging on me a little bit. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. I can hear you just fine. Yes,
Okay.
I can hear.
All right. Okay. Okay, let's move over to Ukraine and Russia a bit. So we had this Witkoff meeting. Can you tell us what happened? Why did Witkoff go there? We're talking about a bilateral summit. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, it's really kind of mysterious. It's hard to understand exactly what happened, and we've got very little in the way of solid information. Of course, what happened is he arrived on Wednesday, I believe it was, and spent a total of nearly 3 hours talking with President Putin. And afterwards, both sides said that the talks were constructive, and encouraging. And then On the U.S. side, okay, the Russians, didn't say anything because they had promised Witkoff that they wouldn't say anything until he went back and he reported to Trump. But the Trump administration started spinning things, and so we started getting these reports that, well, first of all, the Russians had requested these talks, which is almost certainly untrue. Um, and then second, and the Russians deny it flatly. And then second, that some sort of three-way summit would be held: Zelensky, Putin, and
Hey,
Trump.
Dad, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you just fine. I can hear you.
Um, okay, sorry, technical difficulties, but I think we're a little bit better now. Dad, can you pick up where you left off, if you remember?
Okay, yeah, I was just saying that. Okay, one of immediately after the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, the administration started saying that, well, first of all, that the Russians requested the meeting, which was almost certainly not true, and the Russians have denied that, and then also that a three-way meeting, between Zelensky, Putin, and Trump, okay, was in the works, and the Russians denied that too. And then we had this strange incident. I guess there was some sort of leak. A White House official apparently told one of the news services in the U.S. I think it was CBS, but I'm not completely sure. It may have been ABC. That Trump was demanding that actually Putin should first meet with Zelensky, and only then would Trump be willing to meet with Putin. But then the next day they denied that, and I guess Trump himself has denied that. So it appears that there is going to be a meeting between Trump and Putin, which is kind of a surprise, but not a huge surprise, as early as next week sometime. And they're working on a venue. It's probably going to be somewhere in the Middle East, or yeah. So that's as much as we know. Now, what happened? Why is this summit taking place? Well, I think all we can do is speculate at this point. But I think there are a number of possibilities. We can just go through them. One you could say is that, okay, the West realizes that Ukraine is on the verge of collapse, and they're willing to make a deal. That's not impossible, but not likely. Again, it just seems like that still contradicts everything that we're hearing from Western leaders. Another possibility is that, well, this is what the Westerners themselves claim, and I think recently there was some leak, apparently, or a claimed leak to a Polish news services that said that the Russians were willing to make concessions and that they would just freeze the lines and in exchange for a reduction in sanctions. I find that very hard to believe. But that's another speculation that's out there. I think something that's more likely is that Trump who set these deadlines, and of course, like usual in Trump-like fashion, didn't think things through. And as the deadline approached, he realized, damn it, I gotta get out of this, right? Again, we're not hearing about China. It's going to be clear that he was just hot air, that he had made idle threats. And so something had to be done. He had to have something like a deal or an appearance of a deal. And maybe that's why he said Witkoff. Now, why would the Russians agree to this? Maybe they understand that that's what's going on, that Trump is just trying to get, find some way out of his current predicament. He just wants something, maybe just some sort of symbolic success. Well, maybe they've decided there could be a couple reasons why they've gone along with it. And one is, again, they want to show their willingness to negotiate, to talk, in part to the rest of the world, and especially to their friends and allies. And then also, it may be say that this is a chance, again, Putin can speak to Trump directly. Directly is always, Trump is always surrounded by these people or whispering in his ear and telling him what the Russians really want, what the Russians really think. And it seems like he generally believes them, or to a great extent. This will be a chance for Putin to speak to him directly, maybe for several hours. I don't know how long this is going to last. And Trump, being the kind of person that he is probably going to be affected by that. We've often said it's like Trump, if you want to know what his opinion is, find out who he talked to 15 minutes ago. This time he's going to talk to Putin. Now, that doesn't mean that he's going to be able to persuade Trump in a meaningful way to actually change his policy. I think Putin understands that. I hope he does. I'm sure he does. That Trump, may actually walk out of the meeting and say, yeah, Putin made a lot of sense. But that when he gets home and the others that get to work on him, he's going to start in typical, again, Trump fashion. He'll flip-flop. He'll waver, he'll backtrack on some of the things he says. I think that the Russians understand that. But actually just having a chance, to speak to him directly, I think will affect the way Trump looks at the whole thing. He won't change course completely, but he will have heard Putin speak directly, and that will affect his thinking overall. It's like right now, he's surrounded by all these voices and they're all telling him a lot of things about Russia and what Putin wants. Then he'll hear from Putin himself. It'll be a new voice added to all the voices that really affect his thinking. And we may see it may just increase the likelihood that he'll put the brakes on escalation. It may mean that it'll lead to his, occasional temporary U-turns that we see Trump carry out from time to time. So just have a chance to affect his thinking. Again, I don't think we can expect any dramatic change in policy, but it may have a long-term effect on how Trump approaches things, and that long-term effect would be all in all to the benefit of Russia. That's all really I can think. Looking at it from the Russian side, maybe that's there. Now maybe there's something else going on now, but we just don't know. We really don't know what Witkoff told Putin. Apparently, I think it was Peskov or maybe it was Ushakov, the presidential aide, that said that that the Americans made an acceptable offer. Now, we just don't know what that is. Does it concern the war, or is it something else? Maybe it has to do with just bilateral relations, separate from the war. Because this is something the Russians have always kind of pushed to say, maybe we can't solve the problem of the war, but we can improve bilateral relations. And maybe there was something that was said there, and maybe that's something that Putin is looking forward to. It's like, okay, yeah, let's be honest, we can't end the Ukraine war now. We're too far apart. But that doesn't prevent us from, for example, talking about arms control, which is a very serious problem and is actually, becoming more serious by the day right now. Or just, again, maybe restart these talks on restaffing embassies and improving communication. Maybe we can do something. Again, we don't know what Witkoff said and what it is that the Russians found to be acceptable. But of course, I expect that we're going to learn sometime in the not so distant future.
You said Trump wanted Putin and Zelensky to talk first. Do you think that is even in the realm of possibility that would happen?
Yeah. Well,
and if that doesn't happen, do you think it's likely that Trump and Putin will talk?
Well, okay, that was reported in the U.S. media, according to some White House official. It wasn't an official statement by the White House. And the next day, the White House denied it. So we don't know what that's all about. It may be that it was an attempt to sabotage the talks by somebody, within the administration. We don't know. But Trump himself has said that, no, that's not necessary. I'm going to meet with Putin, and he doesn't have to meet Zelensky first.
Okay, so do you think it's pretty likely then that this meeting will take place between Trump and Putin face to face? They seem to both want it, right? They're both okay with it.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. It certainly does. Nobody said that there's any great barrier. They say, yeah, we can do it. We just have to work out the details of when and where.
I think for us to have any hope, we need to hope that they establish a secure line of communication. Didn't they used to just have that red phone that they could pick up and call Moscow? That's what we need. We need Trump and Putin talking regularly like that because what's going to happen, what you're predicting, and I agree, is that this meeting might give us a temporary thaw in the relationship and things will, Trump will get excited about some potential other deal, bilateral deal, or whatever. And then he'll go back to Washington, and then Lindsey Graham and all the neocons will just start working on him again. And then in a couple weeks later, and now he doesn't want to talk to Putin anymore, and he needs to punish Russia again. That's what you're predicting, right? So it might just buy us a little bit of time in terms of, not escalating, but if he doesn't continue to talk, and at the end of the day, just accept reality and just address the concerns that Russia's going to lay out. Because what are they going to talk about with the war? Putin's just going to say the same thing he's been saying over the past 3 years, right? Nothing's going to change.
Yeah, no, that's right. So it's kind of hard to understand. Either the U.S. administration has decided to actually to recognize this reality, to accept the Russian demands, or it's something else entirely. Maybe I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to see the U.S. administration, Trump, actually accept Putin's demands. So I don't see any reason to really hope for an end to the war. That's just not. I don't think that's a realistic hope at this point. The only thing, but maybe there can be a shift in focus to the bilateral relations, and progress really could be made in those cases. Maybe the Trump and Witkoff and them are willing to do that, and there's no reason why they can't. Yet at the same time, we're getting mixed signals. This is the thing. Okay, there's this very excited talk and very encouraging talk about the way things went between Witkoff and Putin here just a few days ago, but almost exactly at the same time, the U.S. came out with a statement saying that Russia continues to constitute an extraordinary threat to the United States, and then just a few days ago too, we got the imposition of the punitive tariffs on India because they're buying Russian oil, and there's just so. What's really going on here? I don't know. Well, this is the thing too. It's just that Trump does not run a tight ship. And so who knows what's going on here? Who knows exactly if there really has been a shift or an understanding, or maybe it's just limited to Trump and Witkoff. And if that's all it is, then unfortunately that probably doesn't really mean a whole lot, because if the rest of his team is just as hostile to Russia as ever, then there's going to be no change, and we're going to continue down the path that we're going down. And unfortunately, I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's just he's too chaotic. The administration really is. They have no clear messaging. It's really a mess. And one thing that these conflicts have done, it's really shown a light on how other countries and other systems can engage in things like diplomacy, war, and trade. Because before that, it used to always be, it felt like there was just one system, and that was kind of the U.S. led system, and there really, it was we have to really engage in diplomacy because it was the U.S. order. The U.S. was the biggest, baddest guy on the block, so we just do war and we police the world and everybody settle down while we do our thing. And then, we're supposed to, everybody use the dollar and trade. But now, because of these conflicts, people are able to juxtapose, these different powers in the way that they engage in diplomacy, the way they engage in trade, the way that they conduct war. And it looks really bad for the U.S. If we have to give a report card for the way we're handling things, it's giving us an F minus, right? Mm-hmm. But how would you rate the way that Russia does these things? And I think this is a really important thing. Maybe everyday Americans and Europeans aren't noticing this, but the rest of the world is noticing that that there is a multipolar world. Other countries, the way that they do conduct war, trade, diplomacy, maybe is better. So maybe we can just start with the bigger question. Just from your observation of the Ukraine conflict, how do you see that the Russians conduct war compared to the way that NATO and the US conducts war?
Well, it's hard to, it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. I guess maybe the one place where you can see them, the two approaches side by side was in the case of the 2023 summer offensive, right? Because it was kind of ballyhooed as a NATO offensive. We say we're going to use NATO tactics. We're using, NATO tactics, NATO equipment, and NATO trained troops. And, we learned even later is more than that. It was just about NATO everything except for the actual soldiers that were fighting and dying, who were Ukrainians. And I think that showed that they're living in a really, and just in another reality. I mean, these NATO tactics are something that were the maneuver warfare, that is so often touted, by NATO, belongs to another era, and we have entered into a whole new era. As the so Yeah, I think that's the huge contrast. Is actually Russia, partly I think they to some extent were taken by surprise. Nobody really understood what war meant in the early 21st century until a war between peer and near peer adversaries, what it actually meant. And we found out, the Russians found out too, and they weren't entirely prepared for it. One thing is they didn't have the drones. They had very few drones actually in their arsenal at that time. And so they were forced to, for example, import drones from Iran. And the Ukrainians had a head start on them. But just both sides, really didn't know what war meant until they started fighting, and now they understand. And Russia is actually geared its whole MIC to support this new war, and it's trained its soldiers to fight this new war, and it's and the Ukrainians, well, yeah, they understand better than anybody else except the Russians how this war is fought, but they don't have the MIC to back them up, because the Western, military industrial complex is still geared to that old war, and to the weapons that were so fundamental to that style of war, and they really haven't made the transition.
Do you think that if we took a global poll of the world now, what would the answer be to the question, which country has the most powerful military in the world?
I think there would be a huge contrast between those people who live within, live in the Western world and are kind of, or in countries that are really kind of within that bubble, and countries outside of it. Because I try to make a point of occasionally just reading, mainstream media stories. And often there are exceptions, there are exceptions to the narrative. And those sorts of kind of things that we discuss quite a bit in the dissident media. But they are the exceptions to the rule. And the rule is that, within the Western media is that NATO weapons are far superior. The Russians are advancing, but at huge cost because they're using human wave tactics and all that, and so on and so forth. I think, over time, even within the West, the viewpoints have changed. And I think that's what the polls are showing. But still, by and large, there's this very smug assumption of Western superiority within the West. I think it's something that governments in the West and their associated media mouthpieces really work very hard to maintain. And they're pretty effective by and large. But outside of the West, things have really changed. I don't think there's any question about it. And so, yeah, there's that whole other world out there that is, which is, which is the global majority. It's really most of the people in the world, and they're looking at things very differently right now. And they no longer fear the West the way they did before this conflict broke out. It's not. Two things have happened. Is there used to be a real respect. For we've talked about the three pillars. The military and the economic. There was a fear of the economic consequences of going against Russia. The fear of the of 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 the Western military, and NATO was supposed to embody that. It's supposed to be the most powerful military alliance in history. And then there was soft power, and all of these have been, greatly degraded. So there's just on the one hand, you don't have the same kind of fear. Russia's, you have to say extraordinary resilience when it comes to sanctions. They're I think really shocked the world, and it's something that the rest, the whole world looked at this and saw this, and that's really changed. I think it's probably affected like the decisions that India is making and so on. They say we don't need to fear the West the way we always did. They're not the only game in town anymore. They're not the economic superpower, and say, yeah, we want to have good relations, but we can live without them. And that's new. And I think we have to say that that's at least in part because of the Russian success in withstanding these sanctions. And then, of course, there's again, most of the world sees this as a war between Russia and NATO, and to a great extent, that's what it is. It's a NATO war being fought by Ukrainians, and they see NATO losing it, and that means they used to have that respect and that fear for NATO. That's gone, but then there's the soft power, and I think it's partly because of the Ukrainian war, and really but also even more so because of what's happening in Gaza. That's been greatly degraded. So you have less fear for the U.S., less respect, but also an increasing actual hatred and anger towards the West. All these things are happening at the same time as a result of these conflicts.
Yeah, and it seems like the biggest problem that the West has is that can't accept reality. It's so good at spinning narratives and pushing out propaganda that it's protected its elite class in that layer of American exceptionalist propaganda. And so how do we get America and our leaders to accept reality? It seems like reality keeps on slapping them in the face and they just ignore it. They just turn around and
Right.
just keep on doing the same stupid stuff again and again.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think it's just, again, it is in great part thanks to our information war skills. That's something that we still are very good at, and it's, I think in many cases it actually has a consequence of self-deception. Of actually deluding our own leaders into thinking that we have these great capabilities, which we no longer have. It's been said by quite a few people that Trump actually relies on Fox News, and I've heard that not just about Trump, but about a surprising number of politicians. I always assume that politicians must be very well informed, because they do have access to intelligence and so on and so forth. But a very large number of them just depend on the evening news, and if they're on the the Republican side of the aisle, it's Fox News, and if on the other side of the aisle is MSNBC or CNN. But in either case, they're being misinformed. It's quite extraordinary. You think the president of the United States would be the best informed guy around, but it's just not true. So, it's just these organs of propaganda in the end, maybe they cease to convince people in much of the world, but they're very effective at convincing our own populations and even our leaders. So we do live in this state of delusion. And, you see things at the edges. I guess one thing, like for example, Trump launched this economic war against China, and pretty quickly, I think, began to see like the turmoil in the bond market, and then the 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 warnings from the major retailers. This isn't working. This isn't working. You can't do this. And he did hear that. So, I mean, he was forced to pull back there. I mean, there are times when reality kind of hits you quickly, but there are a lot of different realities. Like the war in Ukraine, it's far away, and you can lie about it. And the map doesn't change a whole lot from day to day, so you can make up these stories like they always do. I think Trump himself, what did he say? It was like 112,000 Russian soldiers killed since the beginning of the year, and only 8,000 Ukrainians. He seemed to really believe it. We're talking about a 14-1 ratio in favor of Ukraine. But this is, if you're not there and you rely on these media sources or just actually bad intelligence, maybe it seems in many cases intelligence is just passed on from the Ukrainians themselves, you can insulate yourself from reality in many cases, and then it can go on for a long time. At some point, of course, reality has a way of coming home to roost, and you can't avoid it. But that day can be put off for quite a while. It can't be put off forever, but it can be put off for quite a while.
Right. It sounds like, he can ignore the realities that are outside of the United States, what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening even in Israel, Gaza. But if it's something that is hitting home, like you said, with the markets seem to be responding or in turmoil, that reality seems to hit home to him. So that does seem to have an impact. So maybe that's the way to kind of slap some sense into it. You can, if he's not physically there in Ukraine or talking to the other side, then they can spin all they want on the Ukraine war or what's happening in Gaza, and there's a good chance he'll just eat it up. And then, like I said, Americans at the end of the day, they'll watch they care more what's happening here domestically.
Yeah. Right.
So if there is so the way I think maybe that, I don't want this, but I think it needs to happen is that, would it be the responsible thing for these countries, BRICS countries, to just gently put the United States into economic cardiac arrest? Like, okay, here you go, and let it go down, and then that will force it to, be more humble, to be real and be like, look, we can't just punish people. Let's work with these people. We can't just say it's BRICS versus the U.S. empire or NATO versus Russia or whatever it is, how they want to frame it, or the great state in Iran. And then we need help here because all of a sudden we can't afford anything. People are going crazy. It's bad. And now, look, countries like China and Russia, they're not taking advantage and invading America because things are bad here. They're willing to help us get back on our feet, work with us as part of the multipolar world. Maybe that's the way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you can actually make a plan to bring down the U.S. or that's anything that anybody's going to seriously put forward. But I think the U.S. is actually doing that to itself. I think that's what we see happening because of like the crazy.
That's Trump and his 42D chess move. He knows that this is the only way out.
Right.
So he's damaging the U.S. economy itself, going to cause economic collapse because he knows that's Trump doing his his 5D chess.
All right.
No, I'm just joking. There's always people out there trying to make that excuse, though. It's like, there's some grand plan.
Right. Fewer and fewer. You used to hear that a lot more, let's say, 4 or 5 months ago. But there always will people out there making that claim.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess that the potential out really is that he is a bull in the China shop, and just the chaos might trigger the economic collapse, which seemed inevitable, but this will hasten it, the moves that are making, and that might push us into a multipolar world because things will get bad here domestically. Yeah. Let's hope things get bad here.
Yeah, right.
Well,
yeah, but
let's not hope things get too bad here.
Yeah, right. Let's, be careful what you wish for, and then again, it's just if you have an irrational, deluded elite It's just an economic crisis. You would hope would force them to, you know, maybe, again, turn home, come, again, abandon the empire, the imperial project, the hegemonic project, and come back home and focus on our own problems. You would hope so, and I'm sure there are saner voices that'll say that in the end. But you never know with these people. It just might be, they see that the ship is going down as far as they're concerned, and they may make desperate moves. They take risks that they weren't willing to take before in order to save that empire. That's the other danger, though.
Hmm. Okay, last thing, Dad. You just arrived in what, Nizhny Novgorod? Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, a beautiful little city. It's really a lovely
Okay.
place.
Okay, I was just going to say, you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, it's the sixth largest city in Russia. It's about 250 miles east of Moscow. We arrived here by train. It is The city is situated right at the confluence of the Oka and Volga rivers. The Volga is one of the great rivers of Russia, and it's we're right below. There's a Kremlin here. When we hear the word Kremlin, we think of the Moscow Kremlin, but every old Russian city has a Kremlin. It just essentially just means a fort. So there's the old fort. Actually, you can look out the hotel window and see it right above us. And surrounding it, there's just a lot of the old buildings. I mean, it's very pretty. I mean, because you have the rivers, and then you have these hills. It's actually quite steep going up to the Kremlin, and it's parts of it remind me of San Francisco. Because the hills of San Francisco are also very, very steep. But we've enjoyed it. I mean, it's very like other Russian cities. It's though it's very much a city and has what's all the things that cities offer, the restaurants and the cafes and museums and all that kind of thing. It's very spacious and clean, and there's, like I was saying about Moscow, it's just you never have a sense of being crowded. It's just that. And I think that just comes down to Russia being such a big land, that they have plenty of space. So these cities are just, I find them, very appealing. I could see see why somebody would want to live here. I certainly, if I spoke Russian anyway, I would be very happy to live in this city. Um, it's different from Moscow. Of course, it's smaller, but you also notice that um, there you don't see nearly as many foreigners. For example, in Moscow, you see many Central Asians. But you just don't see them. The number of Central Asians here is much smaller than in Moscow. That's one difference. But yeah, no, I like very much what I've seen of Russia so far. The next stop is Kazan. We're going to hop back on the train tomorrow night and go on to Kazan, which is another couple of 100 miles to the east of here.
Okay, interesting. Do you see any signs of the war while you're in Russia?
No, it's you. You see war memorials. For example, there will be, but not to the war actually in Ukraine, but to the Great Patriotic War, which we call the Second World War. And a lot of that, like the memorials, they're older ones from the Soviet era, but they're most recent ones. There's obviously been an effort to um, to remember, to commemorate that war. But as for the current war, occasionally you'll see a little something. But actually, even I think this time, like when I was in Moscow, I saw less evidence of it than I did during my first trip to Moscow in 2023. It's kind of surprising. You wouldn't know. I mean, you just like you wouldn't know that there was a war going on either here in Nizhny Novgorod or in Moscow.
When you say A little something? What do you mean, a little something of a sign of the world? What is?
Well, okay, I'll give you an example. This is like in Moscow. I remember not far from Red Square. There's a kind of a memorial to those who have fallen in the current war, and there are photos up on a wall of different people, and there are flowers laid there.
Oh,
So yes.
Dad, it looks like you completely froze on me.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, it's probably about time for me to stop anyway. But
Oh, it just went okay.
okay. Anyway.
Okay, well let's go ahead and end it there. I think
Okay.
we've ran our luck with we ran our luck with the internet today, so we'll stop there.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot,
All
Dad.
right.
Okay, bye bye.
No problem. Bye bye.